Hi, welcome back. I'm Roger Aronoff, the Executive Director of the Citizens Commission on National Security, and we're back for one final panel on our symposium, which I hope you've been with us all day long, but if you're not, if you haven't been, well, at least you're with us now, and I thank you for that. The symposium is the U.S.-Israeli alliance and the national security implications. And this particular panel is the growing threat to Israel and the region. And we have three more outstanding guests, and I'm going to briefly tell you who they are now, and then I'm going to introduce them one by one, and they will speak, and then we'll have an extended discussion after that. Our first guest, first speaker is going to be Morris Amitay, former director of AIPAC. Then we're going to have Steve Frank of the Lawfare project, followed by Clare Lopez, who is part of the Citizens Commission on National Security, as well as the Center for Security Policy. So our first guest, our first speaker, Morris Amitay, quite a legend in this town. He began his Washington career in the executive office of President Kennedy during the first year of the Kennedy administration following his graduation from Harvard Law School. After his appointment as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Department of State, he served as a vice consul in Italy and as political officer at the U.S. Embassy in South Africa. He later worked in the U.S. Senate as legislative director for Senator Abe Ribicoff of Connecticut. At the end of 1974, Amitay left Capitol Hill to become executive director of AIPAC. In 1981, he left AIPAC and established a law and lobbying firm located on Capitol Hill, specializing in national security issues. He served as vice chairman of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, and is the founder and treasurer of the Washington Political Action Committee, a single-issue pro-Israel PAC. And Maury, take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, I've been around a long time in Washington, and as you get older, your mind is like a filing cabinet. The more things you put into the filing cabinet, the more they get squeezed together, and then it's harder to pull them out. So tonight I'll try to pull out some of the more important things that I've learned during this time, particularly in speaking about Iran as Israel's #1 enemy. I'm probably the only one here who spent an hour and a half with President Rouhani of Iran. This was some 40 years ago with several other Jewish representatives of organizations. The meeting was completely off the record, so I really can't talk about it, except that in meeting with many people representing many movements and foreign governments, they usually lie a lot to you because that's really what they're supposed to be doing. The threats to Israel have remained, but the sources of these dangers, I think, have really changed. One of the biggest fights at AIPAC was against the sale of American F-15s to the Saudis. We won big in the House. There was a close vote in the Senate. We lost. I remember Foreign Affairs Commission Chairman Zablocki asking me, so far, we've heard from the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, if you were in my place, who would you believe? My reply was, Mr. Chairman, I hope that was not a rhetorical question. So it hasn't been easy at times making the case for support for Israel being in the best interest of the United States. Well, today things will certainly have changed. For instance, Prince Bandar, the former Saudi ambassador who was here serving his country for more than 15 years, certainly has a feel for Washington. And the major changes to Israel now comes from three places: Iran, Iran, and you guessed it, Iran. Iran has become an existential threat to Israel, a country the size of New Jersey, some 8,000 square miles. So Israel has expanded unprecedented communication with Saudi and Gulf states due to a converging of interests at this time, which I believe is a very positive development. The major areas of concern with Iran are its direct involvement in Syria and Lebanon and its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them far from its own borders. Iran's involvement in Syria involves aiming to create a land bridge stretching from its own territory to the Mediterranean, better positioning it for a potential conflict with Israel far away from its own territory. Iran has used the chaos of the Syrian civil war to infiltrate Syrian territory with the use of varying forms of direct and indirect personnel, Revolutionary Guards, Iraq Shia militias, and of course, Hezbollah fighters. Israel has pushed back with targeted airstrikes inside Syria to prevent a permanent Iranian presence in Syria. It now talks about these publicly. The latitude Israel has to respond to Iranian troops or militia placements in Syria depends heavily on its cooperation with Russia. Fortunately for Israel, they enjoy a rather strange, friendly relationship with Putin. And we've all heard the story of how when growing up as a child, they helped raise Putin in a Jewish household, and he has not forgotten that to this day. In fact, helping support a Jewish woman now living in Israel, a very elderly Jewish woman. So you never know where help and friends are going to come from, but you certainly are pleased to take what you can get. Israeli coordination with Syria on airstrikes seemed stable initially, but the future is now more uncertain following the downing of a Russian jet last year by Iranian forces and the transfer of S-300 missile defenses to Assad. It's questionable when and how they will be able to use them effectively. In the meantime, I don't see Israel maintaining very carefully orchestrated strikes. The proxy war between Iran and Israel became a direct confrontation and reached Israeli territory last year when an Iranian armed drone was shot down over Israel, not by the Israelis. And then later, an Israeli F-16, which really should have known better, was shot down over Syria during the response. There's no doubt in my mind that a U.S. withdrawal from Syria will negatively affect Israel's position in the Middle East and leave it, along with other U.S. allies like the poor Kurds, weaker. So the news that now at least 400 U.S. troops, up from 200, will remain is welcome. I wouldn't mind seeing this number continue to double as the situation calls for. Will these 400 troops be a token or be able to be some kind of effective force? Do the Iranians think that the U.S. withdrawal is some sort of a ruse? Who knows? The big question is, will the Kremlin keep Iran's influence in Syria at bay to quell Israeli concerns? Will Israel step up further in targeting Iranians in southern Syria, thereby risking a political rupture with Russia? In speaking about Iran, one must speak about nuclear weapons and its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them by Iran. I believe Obama's nuclear deal with Iran was a disaster. I'm not alone in that conclusion. It was very important that the Trump administration withdrew from this deal. There were only 4 Democrats opposed: Senators Menendez, Cardin, Manchin, and Schumer. Schumer, incidentally, did promise not to lobby against it. Obama really pulled out all the stops on this one to keep Democrats in line. For me, even Senator Mark Warner, who interned for me when I worked in the Senate, went along with the majority of his colleagues. Sanctions are working against Iran. The Iranian economy is deteriorating, its currency has collapsed, and there have been several bouts of protests over the past year, and these protests are increasing. Meanwhile, Europe has attempted to preserve the deal. This has really exacerbated transatlantic tensions. But European companies have been scaling down or leaving Iran altogether, despite their governments attempting to get them to stay. But will sanctions and its deteriorating economy lead to political change? I highly doubt it. As Iran celebrated the 40th anniversary of its revolution, we can say that its economic and political future looks bleak as dissatisfaction with the regime continues to grow. So there'll be a lot to watch and to follow closely in the days ahead.
Thank you, Maury. That was terrific. I'll have some questions for you on that later, but next we're going to go to our next speaker, Steve Frank. Steve is a longtime dear friend of mine, I will say that right up front. He's an attorney, retired after a 30-year career as an appellate lawyer with the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington. He is currently a member of the board of directors of the Lawfare Project, which fights anti-Semitism throughout the world. He provides counsel to Sharat Hadin, the Israel Law Center, and Stand With Us, among other Jewish and Israel-oriented organizations. Mr. Frank travels frequently to Israel and Judea and Samaria and serves as the Shomron Regional Council's U.S. representative. Mr. Frank's writings on Israel, the law, and architecture have appeared in numerous publications, including the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and the Jerusalem Post. Steve?
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about BDS, which is, as I'm sure most of you know, it's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the State of Israel. And I want to discuss 3 things tonight in the time that I have. First, I want to discuss the origins of this movement. Second, I want to discuss the breadth of the movement and how, in a way, how ludicrous it is in terms of what it tries to cover and boycott. And the third, there's been a movement among the states to pass anti-BDS legislation, which is now being challenged in the courts on First Amendment grounds. And if any of you heard the previous segment to this with Mark Golub and Professor Alan Dershowitz, you heard Professor Dershowitz, who is certainly the country's leading expert on First Amendment law, state that these new laws do not violate the First Amendment. So getting to the first point, and I think it's extremely important, the origins of BDS. A lot of people think that this just sprung out of nowhere in the 2000s as some kind of human rights movement protesting Israel, comparing Israel to South Africa. That's the basic premise, that Israel is some apartheid state and should be boycotted the way South Africa was, and that just appeared out of nowhere. That is not true. The fact of the matter is that the BDS movement that we currently have now is really nothing but a continuation of the Arab League boycott of Jewish goods that arose in the 1920s. So back then, even before there was a state of Israel, before there was any occupation, before there were any so-called settlements, the Arabs were boycotting not the state of Israel, they were boycotting Jews and Jewish products and trying to prevent there from ever becoming a state of Israel. And that boycott lasted through the 1920s and 30s, along with the riots and ethnic cleansing that occurred during that time in Hebron. And so gradually, as time went on, in the 1970s, Congress passed a law, the Export Administration Act of 1977, which made it illegal for states, other countries, to boycott countries that were friendly to the United States. So that made it impossible, or made it against the law, for people to participate in the Arab League boycott. So to get around that law, they came up with the BDS movement, more in the year 2000. And that was to get around the law so that it wasn't sponsored by states, it was sponsored by Palestinians. And that's the other thing that a lot of people who participate in BDS don't know. They first don't know that it grew out of the Arab anti-Semitic boycott against Jews. And the second thing they don't know is that it is largely controlled by Palestinians. You think it may be controlled or homegrown in Berkeley or what have you, but there is a Palestinian National Boycott Board that pretty much controls BDS movements. So when you are participating, when a person is participating in BDS, not only are you participating in something that grew out of an anti-Semitic movement, you are at the mercy, you are at the will and the direction of Palestinians, and not just Palestinians, because there have been a lot of studies done that have showed ties between Palestinian terrorist organizations and BDS. So that's who, if you're participating in BDS, that's who you're in bed with. Now, it claims that its goals are peaceful, like the goals against South Africa, to make Israel change its policies toward the Palestinians. But the fact of the matter is that BDS founders and supporters have said time and time again that its real goal is the annihilation of Israel. When you see BDS demonstrations on the streets of America, what are they carrying signs? They're carrying signs that say, "Free Palestine from the river to the sea," which is Israel. So that is their real goal. They're very big on campus. Let me state that this movement is not as much of an existential threat as in Iran, but it's a serious threat because it's attempting to make Israel a pariah state like South Africa. So it's very big on campus. That's where it's mostly manifested. But I want to give you an idea of the breadth of what it purports to be. It boycotts companies, and it includes, and you can just Google BDS and boycotted companies, but to give you an idea, here's some of the companies that do business with Israel or have plants in Israel or manufacturing facilities, what have you, that are theoretically boycotted, and you should boycott if you're a member of BDS or follow it. Start off with Ben & Jerry's, Hewlett-Packard, Pampers, McDonald's, Volvo, Coca-Cola, Victoria's Secret, Gap, Timberland, J.Crew, JCPenney, Starbucks, Disney, Gap, Pizza Hut, Citibank, Motorola, and Intel, whose processors can be found in 80% of the world's computers, not to mention just about every cell phone that's ever made that has some kind of an Israeli part in it. So the first thing you do when you meet a BDS person or you attend a BDS demonstration is you ask everybody to hand over their cell phone. There was a picture recently I saw of a gentleman, Dutch gentleman, who was protesting BDS. He had boycott, sanctions, divestment on his shirt, and he was sitting on a motor scooter, and it was a motor scooter for the disabled, and someone recognized that that was a very special kind of motor scooter that is the top-notch scooter made for disabled people, happens to be made in Israel. So there is an irony to that. And so what has happened is that in the last few years, the states of the United States have taken it upon themselves to pass anti-BDS legislation, making it prohibiting, this is the important thing, prohibiting a company that participates in BDS from contracting with the states. 26 states have passed such laws, okay? Now, and what has now happened is that people like the ACLU and some individuals have sued in various courts in Texas and Arizona, in Arkansas and Maryland, I believe, and they've sued, challenged these anti-BDS laws on First Amendment grounds. They claim they have a First Amendment right to boycott Israel, that that's a form of political speech, and that these anti-BDS laws infringe upon that First Amendment activity. Well, as I said, Professor Dershowitz, nobody knows more about the First Amendment than he does. He says it does not infringe upon the First Amendment. Why does he say that? It's because, as he has explained at length in his writings, these anti-BDS laws, they do not in any way prohibit a person from speaking out against the state of Israel, speaking out in support of BDS, participating as an individual in a BDS boycott. They in no way do that. All they simply do is they control conduct. They say that if you as a company, and they generally don't apply to individuals, but if you as a company engage in a boycott of Israel, we will not do business with you. So it's basically the state is saying, we are not going to subsidize your discrimination. And these are quite common, as Professor Dershowitz has pointed out. Most state contracts provide that you can't discriminate on the basis of race, religion, national origin, okay? You can't discriminate against black people or against gay people and have a contract with the state. And nobody would have any problem with that. And it's the same thing with the state saying you can't discriminate against the state of Israel. And without getting into too much heavy law here, there are several precedents of the Supreme Court which uphold these kind of boycotts. There's a case called Fair, which upheld the right of a state to condition its contracting upon not discriminating. And so the fact of the matter is, a matter of law, you may have a First Amendment right to speak out against Israel, you have a First Amendment right to boycott Israel as an individual, but you do not have a First Amendment right to have a contract with the state. So BDS is a serious problem. I think it will withstand the challenges, First Amendment challenges in court, but it really needs to be fought, and primarily needs to be fought on the college campuses where there's an attempt to make Israel into a pariah state, which must be vigorously opposed.
Thanks, Steve. Clare Lopez is the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy. She has served as a member of the Citizens Commission on Benghazi and is Vice President of the Intelligence Summit. Lopez formerly was a professor at the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies, Executive Director of the Iran Policy Committee from 2005 to 2006, and has served as a consultant intelligence analyst, and researcher for a variety of defense firms. She was named a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute in 2011.
Well, I'll thank you very much, Roger, and maybe I'll just continue a little bit with the background. I had the very great pleasure of serving with you, Roger, and some of our other members in the predecessor to the Citizens Commission on National Security on the Citizens Commission on Benghazi, which we formed back in 2013, issued 2 full reports about Benghazi, the second and the final one being in 2016. So that was the genesis, really, of the relationship among a number of us who have been here at this program here today. And General McInerney, of course, here earlier also was part of that. So is Randy Fishbein. And I was privileged to be part of that. As Roger says, I am currently the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy, Washington, D.C. think tank, dedicated, as the name suggests, to issues related to national security. I had the privilege of serving on Senator Ted Cruz's National Security Advisory Team for a short time during the presidential campaign in 2016 and before he dropped out of that race. I have also been in the past the vice president for the Intelligence Summit and a number of other positions related to national security. Began my career out of graduate school with a 20-year career as an operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. Now have been in the private sector for nearly 20 years. So in a way, I'm thinking of my position here today, kind of cleanup in a way, as the last of the panelists to speak. And I'd like to wrap up perhaps a number of the themes that we've touched on, our various panel members have touched on throughout the day today. But to put those points and those very excellent presentations in a kind of a framework that I call the red-green axis. And what does that mean? Well, the red part of that has to do with the hard left communist Marxist element that is so predominant in today's politics and certainly in the struggle of so many on the left against the Jewish state of Israel. And then the green part of that, of course, stands for Islam. It stands for the forces that we have been talking about in the Middle East, the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, certainly Hamas, the Palestinian branch in Gaza of the Muslim Brotherhood, a jihadist organization with a broad, deep representation among front groups here in the United States. So let me sum up just a bit in that framework, the red-green axis, because as different as those terms and ideologies and backgrounds may sound, there is a de facto and an opportunistic kind of an alliance going on right now. And I'll show you what I mean. I'll explain a little bit. Let me summarize first a bit about some of the threats to the state of Israel that we have talked about today. Israel certainly is beset on all sides by enemies of different kinds. So economically, of course, we have just heard Steve talking about the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. And we see, for example, in Europe, among, again, the hard left, socialist, even communist, hard left of particularly Western Europe, support for the BDS movement. We also see some of those same elements in Europe having formed just very recently a mechanism called a Special Purpose Vehicle, or SPV, that would allow Iran to evade sanctions and bypass, get around the U.S. framework of sanctions that has been now reapplied to Iran, and some of these Western European countries, Europe, France, Germany, Britain, France, Germany, taking the lead in that. I will also mention other leftist socialist regimes like that in Venezuela. The regime of Nicolas Maduro, now in free fall, in full collapse, that dating back to the presidency of Hugo Chavez, back 2005 till 2013 when he passed away of cancer. But during that particular period of time, Venezuela and the Hugo Chavez regime in Venezuela drew very close to the regime, the Islamic regime in Iran. The personal relationship between Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Hugo Chavez of Venezuela was a particularly close one. So there is an example of that red-green axis in action. So even to this day, Venezuela, although in collapse, really, in front of our eyes, is still, to this day, giving Iran a foothold, a platform, and a way of helping to evade sanctions. We've heard a great deal today about the military threat against the State of Israel, in particular, of course, by the Islamic State of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, as it calls itself, tops the military threat to Israel. But as we've seen, Iran typically and historically tends to want to project its enmity, its power and influence through proxies. And it does this through a range of Islamic terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, like Hezbollah, of course. And these organizations really surround the State of Israel and threaten it from different directions, certainly from north and south. But increasingly now directly, the Islamic Republic of Iran is taking on the State of Israel. And we saw this, for example, in the buildup of Iranian forces, IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Forces, Quds Force, of course, its intelligence service, on the Golan Heights and in what used to be called Syria, operating directly against Israel there. Let me mention one other regime that I think it's important to take note of in this anti-Israel axis, if you will, and that is what I call the Neo-Ottoman Jihad regime of Turkey, led by the AK party. AKP is the Turkish acronym for Justice and Development Party. That name, by its name alone, identifies that party as a Muslim Brotherhood party, led by the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The regime in Turkey very openly is anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, supports Hamas openly as well. I want to mention on the international stage the role that the UN plays. It provides an international level platform for Israel bashing. And let's take note, the largest voting bloc within the UN, besides the UN itself, the largest international body, is the 57-member head of state OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. That is the head of state organization of all Islamic governments in the world, 56 countries plus the Palestinian Authority. Let me mention some of the European countries again. Let's go back to Western Europe in particular, where a number of European countries have for a very long time, for example, tried to split Hezbollah into a political wing and a military wing. Well, of course, no such division exists, and Hezbollah leadership themselves say so. However, that fiction has prevailed for quite a long time. But give a tip of the hat at this point to Britain, which just within a couple of days has decided to list the entirety of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So that is a very good move on the part of Britain. Let me mention also with regard to Western Europe the rather stubborn efforts, continuing efforts to resurrect the very dead Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that in fact, as Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has said, provides Iran a glide path to a deliverable nuclear weapon, and that is only overtly, while the JCPOA itself studiously ignored the Iranian regime's clandestine, 30-year clandestine nuclear weapons development program, as well, of course, as its ballistic missile program, which is the delivery system for its nuclear warheads. Never mind the joint venture that Iran carries out with North Korea. Let's move on to the political realm of opposition to Israel, and that, I would say, has to do specifically with disingenuous and sort of virtue signaling declaration that anti-Zionism in opposition to Israeli policy is somehow different than anti-Semitism. It's not, and we've heard that addressed earlier today as well. Let me move on to doctrinally, the doctrinal opposition to the State of Israel, because this is really important when we're dealing with the Middle East enemies, Arab Muslim states that are enemies to the State of Israel. Doctrinally, we have to understand that Jew hatred is doctrinally intrinsic to Islam, and it has been since the time of Muhammad. Also, there is a doctrine called the doctrine of sacred space. This holds within Islam that any land ever conquered or occupied by the forces of Islam are forever waqf, that is, land endowed by Allah to the Muslims in perpetuity. And if they lose that land in some way, they must fight forever to get it back. This has a great deal to do with the unending enmity of the Arab Muslim states against the State of Israel. It's why no real and genuine permanent peace deal can never be anything more than a treaty of Hudaybiyah style hudna. Let me move on now to the more red part of this overall axis, the red-green axis. That's been partly the red, partly the green right there. But let me talk about the very close relationship that has developed, maybe counterintuitively even, between forces of hard left, Marxist, even communist and socialist forces and the green. You think on the surface they're very different, but because of the enmity that binds them opportunistically and ad hoc for the moment, they do work together. Let me show you a little bit of what I mean here. For example, again, we're going to go back to Western Europe. Jews are leaving France, making aliyah to Israel in droves because of sharply deteriorating situations for Jews living in France in the face of unchecked, unpoliced Muslim immigration, which amounts to a hijra, to an invasion. Let's look at the United Kingdom, Britain. The rise of Jeremy Corbyn as a serious Labour Party contender in British politics is horrifying because of his anti-Semitism in particular. This is an individual, Jeremy Corbyn, who actually laid a wreath at the gravesite of the Munich Olympic terrorists. He did that in Tunisia in 2014. Let us talk just briefly about the college campuses in the United States. And I think we just heard some of that from our speakers here on this panel. The college campuses in the United States, university campuses, have become absolute incubators of anti-Semitism. But it's not just the red or the green, but they're rather a really close alliance and a collaboration between the two. We see on college campuses things like Apartheid Week with reference to Israel. We see Students for Justice in Palestine. We see, of course, the BDS movement that Steve just talked about. And finally, let me mention, those are sort of on the left side of things, but what is the green counterpart to that on university campuses It is the MSA, Muslim Student Association, the very first Muslim Brotherhood front group established in the United States in 1963 on the university campus of Illinois at its Urbana-Champaign campus. The Muslim Student Association, Muslim Brotherhood front organization, is now spread to hundreds and hundreds of campuses all across the United States and Canada, and has also even moved down to the middle school or the high school level and the middle school level. So there is a perfect example of that red-green axis on American campuses. Let me mention the Democratic Party of the United States. We can't get away from this. Communism has always been anti-Semitic. The Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, increasingly are dominant within the Democratic Party in the United States. And there is an astonishingly willingness to openly self-identify, not just as socialist, but outright communist. That's the left, that's the red, green. We have two newly elected Muslim women elected in the 2018 cycle to the US Congress, both in the House of Representatives. They are both Democrats, and they are both supported by the Democratic establishment. Ilhan Omar, Democrat from the state of Minnesota, and Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from the state of Michigan. Both are viciously anti-Semitic. They are openly and defiantly in association with Hamas, with CARE, that is Hamas doing business as CARE in America, CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, founded by the top Hamas members in the United States back in 1993, and other front groups as well, who donated to their campaigns. Both of these new Congresswomen, Representative Omar and Representative Tlaib, are pro-BDS, anti-AIPAC, American Israeli Public Affairs Commission, and those Muslim Brotherhood affiliates have funded and donated funding to their campaigns. Let me close here. I think I'm probably going a little bit long, but let me close here by mentioning finally a group of NGOs, that is non-governmental organizations that are virulently anti-Semitic. We've heard about the ACLU, certainly, Christ at the Checkpoint, Open Doors, Human Rights Watch, J Street, Students for Justice in Palestine, Sabeel, World Council of Churches, Middle East Council of Churches, and I could go on for a long time. But that is a whole nother avenue of opposition to Israel. Let me conclude with just a very few recommendations of what I would hope to see proceed from actions. That Europe would stop shielding the murderous regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Bravo to the United States government and the Trump administration for ending funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that supports the murderous jihadist Palestinian Authority. Bravo for President Trump pulling out of the JCPOA Iranian nuclear deal, reimposing sanctions against Iran, and now supporting openly the Iranian opposition. Please, President Trump, give up the idea of allowing the creation of another Jew-hating Arab Muslim state on the borders of Israel. And finally, U.S. academia, universities, NGOs and others, stop supporting groups that are defined by anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. Let me stop there. I know I've gone way over time, and allow some time for questions.
It's all right. I didn't want to stop you, and wanted to hear how you really felt. Well, it's been very enlightening, and you know, the theme of the day seems to be Iran. We keep coming back to Iran because clearly they pose the existential threat to Israel and to a lot of others around them. So let me ask you, Maury, and Claire, feel free to weigh in. Are they getting around the sanctions? And as they go down, if they're going down? Do they become more dangerous or less? I mean, can we hope to see them overthrown?
I think the chances of being overthrown are very slim at this point, even though protests have spread throughout the country, various areas, mainly for economic reasons. But I don't see the regime weakened by these protests. I do see them going full blast to achieve nuclear capability. And the fact that under the horrible deal that they negotiated, I think they have 3 weeks notice before people can come in and inspect. 3 weeks, you can get rid of an awful lot of evidence. So I think that the threat definitely remains. I don't see the regime in any real danger now. I think it was interesting, the Zarif resignation, but he was not calling the shots to begin with. And as long as it's the Revolutionary Guard that is in control, I don't see any change coming about in Iran, short of some kind of invasion from without.
Clare, do you have thoughts on that?
I think that the regime in Tehran is perhaps a bit less stable than what you've just stated. Because the media has not been covering the protests and the demonstrations inside of Iran as completely as they should be, we don't know, the public in general doesn't know that these protests, demonstrations, and labor strikes have been going on all over the country of Iran. That's a difference from the time back in 2009 when a lot of the dissatisfaction against the reselection of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president spilled into street demonstrations. That was concentrated more in some of the big cities like Tehran, the capital. But now these protests are all over the country, including, and I think this is important, in the peripheral ethnic minority areas. As you may know, viewers, the periphery, geographically speaking, of Iran is where its minorities are concentrated. You know, the Baluchis to the east, the Kurds, the Azeris in the north, the Ahwaz Arabs, let's say, down in the sort of southern, western part of the country. And so those are the vulnerable areas, and those are up in arms. They're in the street. The economy really has been rocked hard by the sanctions that President Trump has reimposed. I just saw it, I think it's today, the rial has fallen to an all-time low of 140,000 rials to the dollar. That's an all-time new low. People are out of work. I've seen horrific statistics that, you know, something like 80% of the Iranian public lives below their poverty line, not the American one, the Iranian one. So I think the regime is on much less stable ground than otherwise thought. And when you look at the protesters in the streets and you look at, you know, some of the signs they're carrying, those signs are not just about the price of eggs. Those signs are Marg Bar Khomeini, death to Khomeini, death to the supreme leader. There are also signs that are saying, we know who the enemy is, and it's not America. You know how they have the chants after Friday prayers every week, Marg Bar Israel, Marg Bar America. They say, no, our enemy is not Israel. It's not America. It is here. It is the regime. They know how corrupt their leadership is. They know that a lot of the money that should be helping their own economy is flowing outwards to support genocidal regimes like Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas. I think that you're absolutely right. It's not just economic measures that can bring down this regime, but it will need more concerted action and outside help. as well. I think that is something that the United States government should be doing. They are doing. Certainly John Bolton, National Security Advisor, certainly Rudy Giuliani. Long time, both of them have been supporters of the Iranian opposition, in particular the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. But there's going to need to be a lot more done than only sanctions measures.
Particularly since the regime still has the guns,
Right.
and they're not afraid to use them,
Yeah.
which they have shown.
Yeah.
So I'm a little less optimistic, but I like seeing all these signs naturally, and you would hope that with its long history, Iran has been around a very long time in the region, that at some point you will see a change, but I think it will have to be a very, very bloody change, and I think our own country will have to be very, very careful and very smart in how it tries to bring about that change.
Agreed.
Roger,
Yes.
may I ask a question?
Sure, please.
I don't pretend to be an expert in this area, but as long as I have the two experts
Absolutely.
sitting here, I'd like to take advantage of the moment. And we haven't spoken much about Hezbollah and the threat from Lebanon. And I travel to Israel often, and it scares the heck out of me when I think about just the few thousand rockets that Israel faces from Gaza. And then I'm told that there are hundreds of thousands of rockets, which I gather are under the ultimate control of Iran. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, because that's what I fear the next war. I mean, that could really overwhelm Israel's defense system as far as, so.
It will be very, very bloody because these rockets are kept in people's homes. You don't have military targets you can hit, which means you will have to have ground invasion. And a ground invasion usually means casualties. And casualties on civilian population is something that Hezbollah will want to feature. So it will be a very, very tough decision for Israel to make. And unfortunately, I think at some point this decision will have to be made in the near future.
I definitely agree with Maury's assessment. There are now, according to estimates, something like 150,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon under the control of Hezbollah. What has been happening, too, is that Iran has been using both overland and air routes to bring upgrades for those missiles. Very, very high technology guidance systems for those missiles. And this is why you're seeing so many of these Israeli strikes. What they're doing is taking out warehouses and places near, for example, Damascus Airport, where Iran has shipped in some of these high technology equipment to upgrade the missiles, which, just as Maury said, are not only on military bases, which are all over Lebanon, of course, but they're also built as rooms. What Hezbollah has done is built separate, like, additions, rooms on people's homes all over southern Lebanon, and those rooms are missile rocket launching rooms. And this is what Maury means about if they're going to be taken out, they're part of a civilian home. And then, of course, we've seen recently that Israel had to take out a number of tunnels that Hezbollah built under the border between Lebanon and Israel, a half a dozen or more. They have found them, at least the ones they have found. Let me mention something very quickly, though, and this brings it a little away from the Middle East, but here to the United States. We've got tunnels under our southern border, too, between the southern United States and Mexico. And those tunnels are used for drugs, weapons, terrorists, and anything else that wants to come through. They're controlled by the Mexican cartels, the narco-trafficking cartels. But who brought that expertise to the cartels? Hezbollah did. Hezbollah is working with the narco-traffickers of Latin America, Central America, Mexico, and has been for a very long time. The product coming typically out of Colombia, here we come back to Venezuela again, passes through Venezuela and on up through Central America, Mexico, and through the tunnels. They're the exact same tunnels, the same kind of tunnels that Israel has just destroyed up on its northern border, and which, by the way, are the same kind of tunnels Hamas builds down on the southern border of Gaza into Israel. And I've actually been in one of those tunnels. It's blocked off, you know, the one they found. But Hamas operatives actually go to Lebanon to train with Hezbollah on all kinds of things, but tunnel building might be one of them.
So picking up on something Maury talked about, how Hezbollah welcomes these civilian casualties. That's why they do that. We've seen this in Gaza as well. And so aiding this attack, the threat to Israel, is our news media. We see it all the time because they are constantly making it that Israel is acting disproportionately. Israel is, you know, the occupiers. Israel is, you know, it's always portrayed that way. And I'm talking the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, across the board, for the most part, with the media treats Israel as, you know, an enemy, an aggressor, the bad guy in the area, and the real problem there. And that itself poses a very major threat for Israel, is dealing with a very hostile media. And now you throw Trump into the equation, and, you know, they really have a field day with it. So let me move on. Then one more thing about Iran. We had that, speaking of the media, we had basically what was a one-day story when Israel came out with all, they had gotten all the intelligence about Iran's nuclear program. And it was a fantastic coup by the Mossad on what they were able to get, and to show them, look, we've infiltrated you like this. So what would you say we learned by that? What did we learn about Iran? What did we learn about, you know, Israel and the public posture they were taking, and the follow-up to that?
I think what we learned is that Israel's intelligence still does a terrific job. What they were able to do and empty out that whole warehouse and get all of it out of the country is incredible if you really think about it. Now the question is, did they take the best advantage of it that they could have? Of course not. It's always very difficult when you do something like that to be able to have the ramifications of it come to your benefit right away, or in such a proportion that it changes the situation. But it's something they have to continue to work on. It was a tremendous coup. If you think about what they were able to do, it's amazing. And also the fact that they have been able to assassinate people working on their nuclear project over the years. And that certainly makes people working on it a little less enthusiastic about certainly what they're doing. But unless it has the complete support, forget about Europe, unless it has the complete support of the American administration, its Defense Department, its intelligence services, it's really, really tough to be able to do it alone. And that's the battle that we continue to fight. And those of us who've been trying to fight it using the Congress for years to do that. And we see that the Congress is now split. And if you look at the, I have the whole list, I think I have 24 names of all the Democrats who are talking about running for president.
Right.
I can count on 3 fingers those who I consider to be, quote, friendly toward Israel.
Roger, to your question,
Yeah.
specifically, what did we learn from that hall? Certainly, Maury makes very good points about the expertise of the Israeli intelligence service. But kudos go also to the very brave Iranian opposition members that helped them get that information. They learned about it in 2016. They pulled it out in 2017. We never learned about it until way later, but they did that. But what did we learn from it? Well, what we learned is that the Iranians continued, and probably to this day continue, a clandestine nuclear weapons program.
Definitely.
Contrary to the very misleading December 2007 NIE, National Intelligence Estimate, that posited that the Iranian nuclear weapons program certainly ended by 2003 and no later. You know, not only did it not end in 2003, it very likely hasn't ended now. Why would they? This program began under Ayatollah Khomeini in the late 1980s, just before he died, when in the depths of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran said, you know, we're never going to be in this position again, you know, that our existence is threatened. Khomeini to the IRGC, get the bomb. That's when it started. You know what they did? The IRGC went to Pakistan. They went to A.Q. Khan, the so-called father of the Pakistani bomb, and got their very first blueprints and some parts and things. There has never been a time since then that Iran has not had a clandestine nuclear weapons program. And so certainly those documents show that. But you know, even if we look at other documents that are openly available, go back to the IAEA, which issues quarterly reports, governor's reports on the Iranian nuclear program, to November of 2011. It was a very revealing report that detailed in many pages the specifics of how Iran was developing nuclear warheads. That's 2011, and the IAEA reported that. These documents, the hall out of Tehran, show, you know, furthermore that the program for the warheads, certainly the joint venture on ballistic missiles with North Korea, continues. That even if they shifted, you know, some of their program that maybe formerly had been exposed. Again, I'll come back to the Iranian opposition, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, National Council of Resistance of Iran, August 2002, for the very first time publicly, blew the lid off the Iranian nuclear weapons program that at that point had been a clandestine one for 14 years. And at that time, they exposed places like Natanz, the enrichment facility, Isfahan, the conversion facility, and so forth. Those places, obviously exposed, became show places. What else would you do with them? But the program, and according to those documents they hauled out of Tehran, the program, which went by the code name Ahmad, moved underground, I mean literally underground, mountains, bunkers, tunnels, clandestine places, and also those places under control of the IRGC.
Well, I think of Israel as really the real check on Iran. In other words, all these sanctions and everything, I don't know what these other nations are really prepared to do. Israel recognizes Iran as an existential threat, and so it's because Israel is there watching, and I'm sure people inside the country, and you know, that's sort of the only thing that gives you comfort that Iran is not going to be able to create world havoc. You know.
What bothers me, and as an American, I don't want to get involved in Israeli politics, but you have a situation where the political leadership would be more willing to act militarily than the military leadership,
Right.
which takes a more dovish view, for want of a better term. And there have been reports, how true they are or not, I certainly can't confirm, is that Netanyahu was ready to move against these facilities and that his military would dead set against it. And this is something I think that will play out to some extent in the upcoming Israeli elections, where it looks as though Netanyahu's biggest challenge will come from a former chief of staff
Right.
and a couple of other former
Yeah.
chiefs of staff. So you have the funny situation where the political leadership is more military-minded
Right.
than the military.
You know, building on what Moria was just saying, and also hearkening back to some of the earlier panelists from earlier today, Israel more than makes up in returns to the world, to the United States specifically, to regional stability, for any benefits and assistance that we provide to them. And this is an example, what we've just been talking about here, putting a break, at least a break, on the Iranian nuclear weapons and ballistic missile development programs. Israel stands on the front lines there in the Middle East against the forces of jihad and Sharia. If we can remember our history, and Ambassador Ettinger gave a brilliant overview of history just a couple of hours ago. In previous times, the invasion path into Europe goes through the Levant and on up towards southeastern Europe. At least one of the pathways, the last pathway, did that during the Ottoman times. Israel stands athwart that pathway in so many ways, figuratively, militarily, politically, and so many other ways, that we really have to understand, you know, and be grateful for the role that Israel plays in defense, not just of itself and regional stability, but really global stability.
So, Steve, let me come back to you on BDS. So you say it came back around the 2000s, the early 2000s. Can you give us some prominent names and some of the things that have actually happened, like some of the musical acts and things like that? I mean, what's
Yeah,
interesting?
that's it almost is ludicrous. I mean, compared to this kind of threat that we're talking about. But it is, like I say, you know, it's all part of making Israel a pariah
Yeah.
state, and that's important. And yeah, it has had probably its biggest impact is on college campuses and demonstrations and that kind of thing. But the other places is cultural boycotts and huge pressure brought on performers to go to Israel or not go to Israel. So, you know, there have been some famous ones that you've heard of. I'm too old to really know who these people are, but Lorde, the Lorde, I'm sure Roger's heard of her in New Zealand. She canceled the performance just last year. Pink Floyd musician Roger Waters is a big supporter of BDS. Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple, supported BDS. And a lot of other people. Stephen Hawking actually supported BDS. But then there have been other artists and people who've opposed it and have rejected it. And I have to say that I was pleased to see Alicia Keys, who hosted the Grammys. She was under tremendous pressure in 2013 to cancel her concert there, but she went ahead and gave her concert there. And I also am very pleased to say that my son's favorite band was under the Pixies. Was under a lot of pressure not to go to Israel. I know anybody who's over 40 never heard of the Pixies, but apparently, I mean, they were huge in their day, and they still are today. But they went recently, and they performed in Israel. Lady Gaga has performed, Elton John, the Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, Madonna. So, you know, it's a mixed bag, but it comes up.
So what is your answer when they say, we're not anti-Semitic, we just don't like this government of Israel, or we don't like the occupation that Israel does, and are they anti-Semitic, or what can they get around being anti-Semitic by just making those kind of claims?
Well, you know, as I said earlier, I'm a little hesitant to throw around the word anti-Semitic. But I follow the definition that Thomas Friedman gave in the New York Times when he said that if you apply a double standard to Israel, if you apply a standard to Israel that you don't apply to anywhere else in the world, that is a definition of anti-Semitism. And I think in that way, I think that the BDS movement is really almost classic anti-Semitism, because they say that they're boycotting against Israel's occupation, that sort of thing. Well, first of all, as I pointed out, this movement goes back before there was any kind of occupation or settlements or anything like that. Plus, there are many other countries in the world that are occupying, quote unquote, other people's country. I mean, China's occupying Tibet. There's parts of India and Pakistan that are occupying each other. You can go all over the world. Kashmir, there's a lot of world occupiers. There's only one BDS, and that BDS is only directed at one state, and that state just happens to be the only Jewish state in the entire world.
You know, if we want to put the real sort of seal of authority on this question of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, we can look no further than the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar, that is the senior seat of Sunni learning in the Islamic world for 1,000 years in Cairo, Egypt, who has stated in no uncertain terms that there is no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. This coming from the senior scholar of Al-Azhar in Cairo.
So let me go around, take about 30 seconds, assess the threat to Israel, and let's maybe find an optimistic note. That maybe Israel's going to be around for another 1,000 years or so, and these threats are there and they're going to be there, but what do you think, Maury?
Well, if the 2,000 years is a diaspora, I'll take another 1,000 years, and I am optimistic. My father was 6th generation born and was in Palestine. I'm sorry I wasn't 7th, but hopefully it'll be another 10 or 50 generations ahead.
I generally sound pessimistic, but on this topic, I'm extremely optimistic.
Great.
I think Israel is here and it's here to stay, and the world had just better get used to it. Yeah. And the reason for that is that I have tremendous faith and tremendous belief in the Israeli people. Not in America. It's not some American plan that's going to bring peace to the Middle East. Not in American Jews, may they live and be well, but I trust the Israeli people, not any particular Israeli government, but the Israeli people who started out with 600,000, many of whom had just come from concentration camps, and they had a few weapons from Czechoslovakia, and they beat off 5 well-armed, well-trained nations in 1948. They've won every war, no matter how impossible, ever since then. I trust them, I have faith in them, I believe in them, and they will be around, God willing, for many, many years to come.
Here, here.
Yeah.
I could not agree more with our other two distinguished panelists. I'll tell you, I've been in Israel a number of times. I was there last year upon the occasion of moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, you know, as an American, in Jerusalem during that week, during those days, what Steve is just talking about, the spirit of the Jewish people is just astonishing and overwhelming. And if that is the measure, and certainly the historical record stands for itself, but the spirit of the Jewish people, the Israeli people, Israel will be around for a long time.
Well, thank you all. I'm overwhelmed, and I'm grateful to you all, and I'm grateful to JBS and Mark Golub for this day, for introducing the Citizens Commission on National Security to the country. And we've got lots more that we're going to be doing in the coming months and years. Go to our website, ccnationalsecurity.org. Sign up for the emails, social media, support us financially. In the meantime, I again want to thank JBS and Mark Golub, and I'm going to now send this, just stay with us for a couple minutes, and we will come back with concluding remarks of Rabbi Mark Golub. Thank you so much.
Know what programs will be on JBS in the coming week? Then sign up for the JBS Sunday email, which highlights future JBS programming and gives you the JBS weekly schedule, which you can print out and refer to throughout the week. And it's so simple to do. Just visit our new JBS website at jbstv.org and click on Newsletter Sign Up and fill in your name and email address. And every Sunday morning you'll receive an email with JBS programming information. JBS, expanding Jewish understanding, celebrating all things Jewish.
This is also a chance to look at the Middle East without that sort of 24-hour news cycle lens, right? That most Americans, I think, their understanding of the Middle East is through news. That's how we're presented with information. It's not anyone's fault. It's just this is the nature of the world that we live in. And if theater and film and books and art, if art can't provide us a window to actually see these places in a way that's much more sincere and much more connected to our humanity, then what will? I mean, it's a kind of these are just opportunities we have as artists to kind of present these stories in a way that hopefully some people walk out of the Barrymore thinking like, oh, that's what a night in Israel might look like. It's not all katyushas and, tunnels, There's just someone who's trying to talk to a girl at a roller skating rink. Hi, I'm Oren Wolf, inviting you to join me when I sit with Mark Golub on L'chaim, right here on JBS, celebrating all things Jewish.
So there you have it. JBS's exclusive telecast, the Symposium on the U.S.-Israeli Alliance and its National Security Implication, hosted by Roger Aronoff and the Citizens Commission on National Security. This has been a fabulous day for all of us here who've been helping put this together with JBS. And I said it when I had the pleasure of sitting with a panel earlier. This is like being with an all-star team. Everybody here is top-notch. They're intelligent. They're very knowledgeable. They're very experienced. And they have the courage to say things that often you don't get heard said, especially on national television. And I thank Roger Aronoff. Roger, who's still at the desk, fabulous job. Yasher Koach, you should only go from strength to strength. And this panel, who I've become dear with, all the people you brought to us. Mazal Tov, you should only go from strength to strength, all of you. And what you heard discussed today, whether it was BDS, the threat from Iran, the difficulty on the edge of the Democratic Party, the extent to which is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism or not. These are all, the threat that Hezbollah poses with more than 100 Katyusha rockets aimed at Israel. All of this is discussed today. And then in the end, Roger says to his panel, so are you optimistic? And 3 out of 3 gave such gorgeous answers. You guys are fabulous. And that is there's something special about the Jewish sense of neshama of its own people. It's all about the Israeli people. You heard Steve say, what really gives him hope is not foreign governments, it's not foreign arms, it's the nature and the idealism and the strength and the character of the Israeli people. And we've said it over and over again. Israel is not some abstract idea. Israel is flesh and blood. It's women and children and men, all with their arms around each other. And as was said earlier also, there have been generations which have seen blood spilled, doing nothing more than trying to protect the only Jewish state in the world, the Jewish state of Israel. But every generation, every single generation hopes that their children, certainly that their grandchildren, will no longer have to bear arms against nations surrounded by Israel trying to destroy it. And that's something you heard also said by Yoram Ettinger and by virtually everyone here. It doesn't matter how overwhelming it looks. The Jewish people and the state of Israel will always be looking for peace, that one day no Arab child and no Jewish child will ever grow up to bear arms and to try to kill each other or to save the life of someone they love. That's what Israel is all about. And it is, I'm sure you all share this is our hope. Our hope is that one day the Arab world in general and the Palestinians in particular will understand what Steve said a moment ago. The state of Israel is here to stay. And the wisest and the most humane thing to do is for ultimately there to be a peace between all the peoples of the Middle East so that all can live without fear, unafraid, under their vines and under their fig tree, with nations beating their swords into plowshares and the world learning war no more. And you can do it over and over again, but that's the theme. And it was done so beautifully by all of our panelists on this special presentation that I hope you enjoyed today. Yes, we hope you've enjoyed sharing the thinking of all the participants. And I hope it's helped you better shape some of your own thinking. My thanks to the wonderful people here at Interface Media down here in our nation's capital. A terrific staff. They've been so good to me, so good to us. Special thanks to our director, Darren Williams, who did a fabulous job. You know, we come down here all of a sudden and we bring our own perspective, and Darren plays with us and keeps going. Fabulous job, Darren. And to the amazing Adam Hurst, who sort of put all this together, guided us every detail. Adam, I can't thank you enough. I look forward to working with you and your entire gorgeous staff, you behind the camera, and you behind the camera, and you behind the camera. All of you, just fabulous. And then again, my special thanks to Roger Aronoff, who made this entire symposium possible and who is doing extraordinary work for both the United States of America and for the state of Israel. Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you, Serge Goldberg. Thank you, Ruth Golub. Thank you, John McDevitt. Thank everybody. Thanks, Sloan Copeland, all of you on the JBS staff who also made sure this ran so smoothly for me. Until the next time, from Washington, D.C., I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.